The richest cowboy in Montana hid his name, his fortune, and his entire identity. But why was the only woman who welcomed him the one person everyone else had already rejected? Caleb Whitaker stood in the middle of a storm-soaked ranch yard, mud clinging to his boots as Rose Bennett handed him a pair of worn work gloves instead of asking who he truly was. Thunder rolled over the Montana mountains, and the man who owned thousands of acres realized the woman everyone ignored might be the only person who ever saw him clearly. But when his secret finally surfaced, would the trust between them survive? Subscribe and join us for more unforgettable frontier stories. The Whitaker Ranch sat beneath the wide Montana sky like a kingdom built from dust, grass, and years of hard decisions. From the highest point of the main house, Caleb Whitaker could see the cattle moving slowly across the valley, dark shapes against the golden fields. Thousands of acres stretched beyond the fences. Barns stood solid against the wind. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the workers' cabins as evening settled over the land. It was everything a man was supposed to want. And yet Caleb sat alone at the end of a long dining table meant for 20 people. A silver coffee pot rested near his hand, untouched. The candle beside his plate had burned halfway down. Across the polished wood sat 3 empty chairs where, only an hour earlier, 3 families had taken turns telling him what a fortunate man he was. Fortunate. That word had followed Caleb Whitaker everywhere. Fortunate because he inherited the largest cattle operation in the Montana Territory. Fortunate because his father's name opened every door from Pine Creek to Helena. Fortunate because any woman in the territory would gladly stand beside him. Caleb looked down at his untouched dinner and wondered when being wanted had started feeling so much like being purchased. The door to the dining room opened quietly. Margaret Whitaker stepped inside carrying a stack of letters. She was Caleb's aunt, his father's older sister, and the woman who had managed the household since Caleb was a young man. She knew him better than most people. That was exactly why she noticed the silence. "You didn't eat," she said. Caleb glanced at the plate. "Wasn't hungry." Margaret placed the letters beside him. "You said that yesterday. I wasn't hungry yesterday either." She studied him for a moment, then pulled out the chair across from him. "Caleb." He leaned back slightly. "I know that tone. Good. Then you know I'm about to ask something you won't like." The corner of his mouth moved slightly, but it wasn't quite a smile. "You usually do." Margaret folded her hands. "Are you unhappy?" The question hung between them. Outside, a horse moved somewhere near the stable. The sound of hooves against packed dirt echoed faintly through the open window. Caleb looked toward the darkness beyond the glass. For years, people had asked him about cattle numbers, how many acres he owned, how many contracts he signed, how much money the Whitaker name controlled. Almost nobody asked if he was happy. "I don't know," he finally said. Margaret's expression softened. "That might be the most honest answer you've given me in a long time." Caleb looked back at her. "You heard what Evelyn's father said tonight," Margaret sighed. "Everyone heard. He didn't ask what I wanted. He talked about what his daughter would gain by marrying me." "Caleb, that is how many people think. That's the problem." He stood and walked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the Whitaker Ranch stretched into the darkness. The same land his father had fought for. The same land Caleb had spent his entire life protecting. "I can't remember the last time someone looked at me and didn't see this place first." Margaret watched him quietly. "Evelyn Parker is a respectable woman." "I didn't say she wasn't. She comes from a good family, I know. She would make a suitable wife." Caleb turned around. "That's exactly what everyone keeps saying." Margaret said nothing, because she understood. Suitable, acceptable, useful. Those were words people used when they were talking about a business arrangement, not love. 3 days earlier, Caleb had attended a dinner in town. A woman he barely knew had spent the entire evening asking questions about the Whitaker estate. How many horses did he own? How many employees worked for him? How large was the main house? Not once had she asked what books he liked. Not once had she asked what he feared. Not once had she asked who he was when nobody was watching. That night, riding home alone beneath the cold Montana stars, Caleb had made a decision. A reckless one, maybe even a foolish one. But for the first time in years, it felt like a decision that belonged to him. "I'm leaving," he said. Margaret stared at him. "Leaving where?" "Somewhere nobody knows my name." The room became still. "Clip, I need to know something." "What?" He looked at his reflection in the dark window. "If I had nothing, would anyone still choose me?" Margaret's face changed, not because she thought the question was foolish, because she knew how much it cost him to say it. "You're talking about walking away from everything your family built, for a while. You cannot simply disappear. Why not? Because you are Caleb Whitaker." He gave a quiet laugh. "That's the problem." The next morning, before sunrise, Caleb walked through the ranch house one final time, not as the owner, not as the man everyone bowed to, just a man saying goodbye to a life that had never truly felt like his. He left the expensive coat hanging in his room. He left the gold watch his father had given him. He left the papers, the contracts, the letters from families hoping to connect themselves to the Whitaker name. On his bed, he placed one simple note. Margaret found it later. It contained only a few words. "I need to find out who I am without all of this." Caleb chose an old brown saddle from the barn, nothing special, no family markings, no silver decorations. He packed a small bag with basic clothing, a few coins, and a worn leather journal. Then he rode away before the ranch hands began their morning work. The wealthy owner of the Whitaker Empire disappeared into the Montana wilderness, and by the time the sun rose over the mountains, Caleb Whitaker no longer existed. At least that was the plan. His new name was Cole Turner, a wandering cowboy looking for honest work, a man with worn boots, a tired horse, and no story anyone cared to hear. He rode north for several days. The roads were rough. The wind carried dust across the open plains. At night, he slept beneath the stars or inside small roadside inns where nobody recognized him. For the first time in years, people looked past him, and strangely enough, that felt like freedom. But Caleb did not know that somewhere ahead, near the small frontier town of Pine Creek, there was a woman who understood what it felt like to be overlooked. Her name was Rose Bennett, and the whole town had already decided she would never be chosen. Rose lived on a small piece of land outside Pine Creek, where the fence posts leaned and the barn roof needed repairs. Every morning, before most people in town were awake, she lit the stove. She kneaded dough. She fed the chickens. She carried water from the well. Her hands were rough from work, but she kept them clean. She kept her house neat. She kept moving, because when the world had already decided what you were worth, sometimes the only thing you could do was prove it wrong quietly. In Pine Creek, people talked. They talked about the weather. They talked about cattle prices. They talked about neighbors. And they talked about Rose. Some said she worked too hard because nobody would marry her. Some said she should stop dreaming about love. Some said a woman like her needed to accept being alone. Rose heard those words. She always did. But she never let them stop her from opening the door each morning. On the same afternoon, Caleb Whitaker entered the Montana roads as a man with nothing. Rose Bennett stood behind the counter of the Pine Creek market, selling fresh bread she had baked before sunrise. Neither of them knew it yet, but the richest cowboy in the territory was riding toward the one woman who would never care about his fortune. And the woman everyone ignored was about to become the only person who saw him clearly. The road into Pine Creek was little more than two worn tracks cutting through the Montana grasslands. Caleb, riding under the name Cole Turner, followed the trail with his hat pulled low against the afternoon sun. His horse moved at a steady pace, its hooves pressing into the dry earth while a cool breeze carried the smell of pine from the distant mountains. For the first time in years, nobody turned their head when he passed. No ranch hand stopped what he was doing. No merchant stepped outside to shake his hand. No one rushed forward asking about cattle contracts or business arrangements. He was just another cowboy traveling west with a worn saddle and a horse that looked like it had seen better days. And strangely, Caleb found comfort in that. Near sunset, he reached the outskirts of Pine Creek. The town was small, built around a wooden main street lined with a general store, a blacksmith shop, a modest church, and a diner where ranchers gathered after long days in the fields. A wooden sign hanging above the road creaked in the wind. Pine Creek. Caleb stopped near the water trough and looked around. Nobody knew him here. That was exactly what he wanted. He tied his horse outside the local diner and stepped inside. The room smelled of coffee, fried potatoes, and fresh bread. A few cowboys sat at the counter, talking quietly about cattle prices in the coming winter. Caleb took a seat at the end of the counter. The waitress placed a chipped ceramic mug in front of him. "Passing through?" she asked. "Looking for work," Caleb answered. She looked at his worn coat and dusty boots. "You'll find plenty of ranches needing hands. Whether they're willing to pay is another matter." Caleb nodded. "That's fair." She poured coffee into his cup. "You got a name?" He hesitated only a moment. "Cole Turner." The name sounded unfamiliar. Good. It was supposed to. Outside the diner window, Caleb noticed a woman walking along the street carrying a wooden crate. She moved carefully but confidently. She wore a simple brown dress covered by a work apron, sturdy boots, and a faded blue shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was not dressed like someone trying to impress anyone. She looked like someone who had work to finish. A few people nearby noticed her too, but their expressions changed. Not with kindness. Caleb watched as the woman entered the general store. A few minutes later, voices drifted through the open doorway. "Rose Bennett again. She's always selling something. She ought to spend less time pretending she can run a farm." Caleb looked toward the door. The waitress noticed. "That's Rose." "Who?" She gave him a curious look. "You're new here, aren't you?" Caleb nodded. The waitress lowered her voice. "Rose Bennett. Lives outside town. Works harder than most men around here, but folks still find something to say." "Why?" The waitress shrugged. "People always find something to say." Caleb looked back through the window. Rose stepped out of the store carrying her crate. She did not look angry. She did not look defeated. She simply adjusted her grip and continued walking. That caught his attention. Most people reacted when they were judged. Rose seemed to have learned how to keep moving. The next morning, Rose Bennett woke before sunrise. The small farmhouse was quiet, except for the sound of the stove fire catching. She poured water into a metal pot, added coffee grounds, and waited beside the stove while the first light entered through the kitchen window. Her home was not large. The walls needed fresh paint. The floorboards creaked near the doorway. The kitchen table had a small crack running through the center. But everything had a place. The flour sacks were neatly stacked. The jars of preserved vegetables lined the shelf. The tools near the back door were cleaned and ready. Rose believed a person could have little and still take pride in what they had. After breakfast, she walked outside. The morning air was cold enough to leave a faint mist with every breath. Her chickens moved around the yard. A young calf stood near the fence, waiting for feed. Rose checked the fence line first. One post had loosened during the night. She grabbed a hammer from the shed and fixed it herself. By 8 o'clock, she had already fed the animals, repaired the fence, and prepared several loaves of bread to sell in town. Her brother Thomas arrived just as she loaded the basket onto the wagon. Thomas Bennett was older by several years, with tired eyes and hands worn from ranch work. "You're going into town?" Rose looked over her shoulder. "I need to sell these. You don't have to listen to those people." She smiled slightly. I don't. Thomas looked toward the road. That doesn't mean they don't hurt you. Rose placed another loaf into the basket. They can say what they want. Thomas sighed. That's not what I asked. For a moment, Rose stopped. Then she covered the basket with a cloth. Someone has to keep this place running. Thomas knew better than to argue. He had watched his sister carry responsibilities most people never saw. But he had also watched the world make her feel like she was somehow less because of things she could not change. And that bothered him more than he admitted. By late morning, Rose arrived in Pine Creek. The general store owner smiled when she placed the bread on the counter. You've outdone yourself again. Thank you, Mr. Wallace. He counted the loaves and wrote the amount on a small receipt. You know, folks around here talk a lot, but they always seem to buy every loaf you bring. Rose smiled. People can say one thing and do another. Before Mr. Wallace could answer, Samuel Cross entered the store. He was a successful ranch owner with a reputation for making every deal work in his favor. He wore a clean coat, polished boots, and carried himself like the whole town belonged to him. His eyes moved from Rose's bread to Rose herself. Well, Bennett, Rose turned. Samuel, he picked up one loaf and examined it. Still trying to make a business out of this? I've been doing just fine. Samuel smiled. Have you? The store became quieter. Rose placed the remaining bread neatly on the counter. What do you need? Nothing. He set the loaf down. I just wonder how long you plan on fighting a battle you already lost. Thomas, who had arrived behind her, stepped forward. That's enough. Samuel ignored him. Everyone knows that little farm is barely standing. Rose looked at him calmly. My farm is still standing, for now. The words were simple, but they carried a warning. Samuel left with a smile that bothered Rose more than an insult would have, because she knew men like Samuel rarely spoke without wanting something. Same afternoon, a dusty rider entered Pine Creek. Caleb Whitaker, now Cole Turner, stepped down from his horse outside the blacksmith shop. He asked about work. The blacksmith pointed him toward several ranches. Try the Bennett place. Caleb looked over. The Bennett place? Rose Bennett's farm. The blacksmith shrugged. She always needs another set of hands. A few men nearby laughed. She might hire anyone desperate enough. Caleb ignored the comment. He had heard enough judgment in his own life. He knew what it sounded like. He rode toward the edge of town. The road narrowed as the buildings disappeared and open land replaced them. Soon he saw a small farmhouse surrounded by fields. A woman stood near the fence repairing a broken section. Rose Bennett. Caleb stopped at the gate. She looked up. For a moment, neither spoke. The man standing before her looked nothing like the wealthy ranch owner he had left behind. His coat was faded. His gloves were worn. His face carried the dust of the road. Just another cowboy looking for a place to belong. Can I help you? Rose asked. Caleb removed his hat. I'm looking for work. Her eyes moved over him briefly, not judging, just noticing. You know ranch work? I know enough. That's what everyone says. A small smile appeared on his face. And are they usually right? Rose looked at him for a moment. Then she opened the gate. Sometimes. Caleb stepped down from his horse. What kind of work do you need? Rose glanced toward the fence line. That depends on what, whether you're the kind of man who leaves when the work gets difficult. Caleb looked at the broken fence, then back at her. Nondar Rose studied at him quietly. Then she handed him a pair of work gloves from the porch. Start with that section. Caleb took the gloves. Their fingers did not touch, but something about the simple gesture stayed with him. No questions about where he came from, no interest in what he owned, no curiosity about his family name. Only a chance, and as Caleb walked toward the fence, he realized something he had not expected. The first person in Pine Creek willing to give him a place was the woman everyone else had already decided was not worth choosing. The fence line stretched along the edge of Rose Bennett's property, a crooked row of wooden posts fighting against years of wind and weather. Caleb picked up the hammer Rose had left on the ground and examined the loose boards. Back at the Whitaker Ranch, he had watched hundreds of men do this kind of work. He had signed papers approving repairs. He had paid crews to replace miles of fencing, but he had rarely been the one holding the hammer. The first swing was harder than he expected. The nail bent. Caleb stared at it for a moment. Then he pulled it free and tried again. From the porch, Rose watched quietly. She had expected a man looking for quick money to complain about the work. Most hired hands who came through Pine Creek wanted the easiest tasks and the fastest pay. But Cole Turner did not complain. He simply adjusted his grip and kept working. By sunset, he had repaired half the damaged section. Rose stepped outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You missed a board." Caleb looked up. "Where?" Pointed toward the corner post. He walked over and looked. She was right. A small smile crossed his face. "You always find the things other people miss." Rose handed him a cup. "Usually, that sounds useful. It also gets annoying." He accepted the coffee. Their hands came close, but neither rushed the moment. "Thank you," he said. Rose looked toward the fence. "You worked all day. I was hired. That doesn't mean everyone says thank you." Caleb looked at her. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a simple truth. For some reason, that stayed with him. The next morning, Caleb arrived before sunrise. Pose was already outside. She stood near the barn holding a bucket of feed, her hair tied back and her sleeves rolled above her wrists. "You're early," she said. "So are you. This is my place." Caleb glanced around. "And I suppose that means you never sleep." A small smile appeared. "Something like that." She handed him the second bucket. "You'll help with the animals first." Caleb took it. At the Whitaker Ranch, people brought him reports. Here, Rose handed him work. There was something honest about it. No one was trying to impress him. No one was trying to gain anything from him. For the next several days, Caleb learned the rhythm of Rose's life. The mornings started before the sun reached the mountains. The chickens needed feeding. The water troughs needed filling. The fences needed checking. The small herd needed attention. It was not glamorous work. There were no business meetings, no expensive meals, no men waiting for his decisions. Only dirt under his boots and the sound of animals moving through open fields. And Caleb discovered he did not hate it. In fact, he began looking forward to it. Rose noticed his mistakes, but she never laughed. One afternoon, while he struggled with a stubborn gate hinge, she stood nearby watching. "You're pulling too hard." Caleb looked back. "I thought that was the idea, not with old wood." She walked closer and pointed. "The hinge has been fighting the weather for years. You have to work with it, not against it." Caleb stepped aside. "Show me." Rose took the tool from his hand. Her movements were simple, patient. She adjusted the hinge, tightened the bolt, and tested the gate. It moved smoothly. Caleb watched her. "You make that look easy. It isn't." She handed the tool back. "It just gets easier after you've done it 1,000 times." Those words stayed with him because he knew exactly what she meant. Some things only became possible after years of carrying them. That evening, they sat outside the farmhouse. The sky turned orange behind the mountains. Rose repaired a torn piece of fabric while Caleb cleaned his boots. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. That surprised him. At the Whitaker mansion, silence had always felt empty. Here it felt peaceful. "You always lived here?" Caleb asked. Rose kept her eyes on the fabric. "Most of my life. Never wanted to leave." She paused. "Sometimes." "What stopped you?" Rose looked toward the fields. "My parents built this place." A breeze moved through the grass. I couldn't bring myself to walk away. Caleb nodded. He understood that more than he expected. People in town talk about you. Rose's hands stopped. For a moment, he wondered if he had crossed a line, but she only continued sewing. People in town talk about everyone. They shouldn't, no. She looked at him. But they do. There was no anger in her expression. That almost bothered Caleb more. He was used to people fighting back when they were hurt. Rose had learned how to carry things quietly. "Doesn't it bother you?" he asked. She looked down at the stitching. "Of course it does." The honesty surprised him. "But I have work to do. Animals to feed, bills to pay." She placed the finished cloth beside her. "I don't have time to become the person other people want me to be." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Back at his own ranch, people spent their days trying to become important. Rose spent hers simply being useful, and somehow, she seemed richer than most people he knew. A few days later, trouble arrived at the Bennett property. Samuel Cross rode up near the front gate with 2 men from his ranch. Caleb was repairing a section of fence when he saw them. Rose walked outside. "Samuel," he removed his hat, and his eyes moved toward Caleb. "New worker?" "Yes." Samuel looked Caleb over. "Looks like you found someone willing to work cheap." Caleb said nothing. Rose stepped forward. "He works hard," Samuel smiled. "Everyone says that at first." Rose's expression changed slightly. "Do you want?" Samuel pulled a folded paper from his coat. "I came to remind you about your overdue supply account." Rose looked at the paper. "I paid that last month." Samuel unfolded it, "Not according to this." Caleb noticed something. The paper looked clean, too clean. The ink appeared newer than the rest of the document. Rose took it carefully. "I have my receipt." Samuel's smile faded slightly. "You sure?" "Yes." Her voice remained calm. "I keep every receipt." She turned and walked inside. A minute later, she returned with a small wooden box. Inside were carefully organized papers, receipts, bills, records. She found the one she needed and handed it to him. Samuel looked at it. For a brief moment, his confidence disappeared. Then he folded the paper. Must have been an error. Say held his gaze. Must have been. Samuel looked toward Caleb, then back at Rose. "This little farm is getting harder to maintain." Rose did not answer. He rode away. After they disappeared down the road, Caleb looked at her. "You keep every document?" Rose placed the papers back into the box. "People remember things differently when money is involved." He nodded. That answer told him more than she probably intended. Later that evening, Caleb found Rose fixing a broken strap on a bag. "You should have told him you weren't alone." She looked up. "Why? Because some people only respect strength when they see it standing beside you." Rose threaded the needle through the leather. "I don't need someone standing beside me so people will listen." Caleb was quiet. Then he said softly, "I didn't mean that." She looked at him. "I know." Another silence followed, but this time neither of them looked away. Caleb had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Rose Bennett wanted nothing, not his money, not his name, not his approval. She had given him work because she needed help. She had offered him coffee because he had worked all day. She had trusted him because in her eyes, he was simply a man who needed a chance. And Caleb realized something that unsettled him more than any business problem ever had. The woman everyone in Pine Creek overlooked was the first person in years who made him feel visible. But the longer he stayed, the harder it became to remember that he was supposed to be pretending. Because somewhere between repairing fences and sharing quiet evenings on a wooden porch, Cole Turner had started becoming the man Caleb Whitaker wished he had always been. The days in Pine Creek began to settle into a rhythm Caleb had never known. At the Whitaker Ranch, every morning began with decisions. Reports waited on his desk. Workers waited for instructions. Business letters arrived from distant towns. Every choice carried a number attached to it. How much land? How many cattle? How much profit? Here his mornings began with a cracked barn door, a bucket of feed, and Rose Bennett calling from across the yard asking if he had checked the north fence. There was no pressure to impress anyone, no reason to pretend he had all the answers. If he did not know something, Rose simply showed him. If he made a mistake, she corrected him. And then they moved on. That was something Caleb was not used to. At the Whitaker Ranch, mistakes became conversations behind closed doors. Here, a mistake was just a mistake. A broken board could be replaced. A loose hinge could be tightened. A man could learn. One morning, Caleb struggled with a stubborn wagon wheel near the barn. The wooden spoke had shifted, and no matter how he adjusted it, the wheel refused to sit properly. Rose walked by carrying a basket of laundry. "You're fighting it again." Caleb looked over. "Is that what I do? Sometimes." He wiped his hands on his pants. "And what should I do instead?" Rose set the basket down. "Listen." He raised an eyebrow. "To a wagon wheel? To anything that's been around longer than you?" A small laugh escaped him. It surprised them both. Rose smiled faintly, then knelt beside the wheel. "The wood swells after rain. You can't force it back into place." She adjusted the piece carefully. "You have to understand why it moved." Caleb watched her hands. They were not delicate. They carried small scratches and signs of years spent working. But every movement was careful, patient. He realized something. Rose never treated things as worthless just because they were worn. Not tools, not animals, not people. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked. Rose looked at the wagon. Necessity. The answer was simple. But Caleb heard everything she did not say. That afternoon, he rode into town with Rose to deliver bread. Pine Creek was busier than usual. A shipment had arrived at the general store and several ranch families were gathered near the street. Caleb helped unload the baskets. Nobody paid much attention to him. That was still strange. For most of his life, people noticed Caleb before he entered a room. They adjusted their behavior around him. They chose their words carefully. Here, a man carrying bread was just a man carrying bread. Rose handed a loaf to Mrs. Turner, an elderly woman who lived near the church. "Thank you, dear. You're welcome." The woman looked at Caleb. "New hired hand?" Rose glanced at him. "Shh." Caleb tipped his hat. "Cole Turner." Mrs. Turner smiled. Good to see Rose has someone helping her. The words were kind, but Caleb noticed Rose's expression change slightly, not because of the woman, because of the assumption, someone helping her. As if Rose had never been capable before. As if she had been waiting for someone to arrive. Later, while walking back to the wagon, Caleb said quietly, "That bothered you." Rose looked ahead. "What?" What she said. Rose adjusted the basket in her arms. "It's not a big deal. That usually means it is." She stopped walking. For a moment, she looked ready to dismiss the conversation. Then she sighed. People see what they expect to see. Caleb waited. They see a woman living alone and assume she must be lonely. She looked toward the small farms scattered beyond town. They see a woman who works hard and assume she must have no other choice. Her fingers tightened slightly around the basket handle. "They don't see that I built something." Caleb nodded. "I see it." Rose looked at him. The street behind them was quiet. A wagon rolled past. Somewhere nearby, a horse pulled against its reins. "You don't know me that well, Cole." "No," he paused. "But I know enough." For a moment, neither moved. Then Rose looked away and continued walking. But Caleb noticed something. The small smile that appeared before she turned away, it stayed with him the rest of the day. Weeks passed. The Montana summer slowly gave way to cooler evenings. The fields turned deeper shades of gold. The mornings carried a sharpness that reminded everyone winter was coming. Caleb and Rose grew comfortable around each other, not in a way that needed constant conversation, in a way built from small things. A second cup of coffee left near the stove because Rose knew he would be tired. A repaired fence gate Caleb fixed before Rose even noticed it was loose. A warm coat hanging near the door because he had seen her shivering the day before. Neither mentioned these things. They simply happened. One evening, a storm moved across the valley. The wind arrived first. It pushed through the trees and rattled the windows of Rose's farmhouse. Caleb looked toward the pasture. The cattle. Rose was already reaching for her coat. The west fence. They moved quickly. Rain began falling as they crossed the field. The ground became soft beneath their boots. Lightning flashed over the mountains. When they reached the fence line, they saw the damage. A section had broken open. The cattle were moving toward the gap. Rose grabbed the lantern. Caleb stepped forward. "I'll handle it." She looked at him. "You don't know this herd." "I know enough." She almost smiled. "You sound like me." The storm grew stronger. Together they worked, not as employer and worker, not as a wealthy ranch owner and a struggling farmer, just two people trying to protect something they cared about. At one point, Caleb slipped in mud while carrying a fence post. Rose reached out instinctively. For a second, her hand caught his arm. Neither moved. The rain fell around them. The lantern flame shook in the wind. Then Rose let go. "You all right?" Caleb looked at her. But the answer was not only about the mud. Hours later, when the last cattle were safely back inside the enclosure, they returned to the farmhouse soaked and exhausted. Rose placed a towel near the door. Caleb stood by the stove, watching the fire grow. "You could have left," Rose said. He turned. "What? The storm? The work? All of it?" Caleb looked confused. "Why would I?" Rose looked down. "Most people would." He was quiet. Then he said, "I'm not most people." She looked at him. No grand speech, no promise, just 4 words. But somehow they meant more than anything else he could have said. That night, Caleb sat alone in the small room Rose had given him. The rain tapped against the window. He opened the old leather journal he had brought from the Whitaker ranch. For the first time in years, he did not write about cattle numbers or business plans. He wrote about a woman who remembered how he liked his coffee, a woman who corrected him without making him feel small, a woman who had no idea he owned thousands of acres and still treated him like he mattered. Caleb closed the journal. Outside, the storm moved away from Pine Creek, but inside him, something had changed. The hardest part of the disguise was no longer pretending to be poor. The hardest part was knowing that one day Rose would learn he had never been who he claimed. And he had no idea whether the woman who had finally seen him would still look at him the same way when she knew the truth. For several weeks, Caleb managed to keep the secret buried. In Pine Creek, he was Cole Turner, a ranch hand, a man looking for honest work, nothing more, and Rose treated him exactly that way. She did not ask where he had come from. She did not ask why he carried himself differently from the other hired hands. She did not question why a man with worn boots and patched clothing sometimes looked like he belonged in a much finer room. That was what made hiding the truth so difficult. Rose never searched for reasons to doubt him, she simply trusted him. And every time she did, the weight of the secret grew heavier. One morning, Caleb was repairing a section of the barn roof when he saw a rider approaching from the main road. The horse was well trained. The rider sat straight in the saddle. Even before the person reached the gate, Caleb knew this was not someone from Pine Creek. The rider stopped near the fence. A woman stepped down. She wore a dark traveling coat, clean gloves, and a hat that had clearly been made in a much more expensive shop than anything sold locally. Caleb froze. Margaret. His aunt looked at him for a long moment. Then she glanced at the roof, the old barn, and the simple clothes he wore. "I was wondering how long you plan to continue this." Caleb climbed down the ladder. "You shouldn't be here." That is an interesting thing to say to the man who disappeared without telling anyone where he was going. He looked away. "Did something happen?" Margaret removed a folded stack of papers from her bag. "Your absence happened." She handed them to him. Caleb looked down. Financial reports, letters, documents from the Whitaker ranch. "The winter contracts are coming up," she said. "The cattle buyers are waiting. Your foreman can manage the daily work, but there are decisions only you can make." Caleb folded the papers, "Then make them." Margaret stared at him. "You know that isn't how this works." For years, Caleb had been the person everyone depended on. He had built his reputation by showing up, by making decisions, by carrying responsibility. But now he stood beside an old barn in a borrowed life, trying to discover whether he could be something other than a name attached to a fortune. "I'm not ready to go back," Margaret lowered her voice. "Is this about Rose Bennett?" Caleb said nothing. That was enough of an answer. Margaret looked toward the farmhouse. "She is the reason you stayed. She is a good person." "I didn't ask that." He looked at his aunt. Margaret softened slightly. "Caleb, be careful." "With what?" "With giving someone a version of yourself that isn't complete." The words stayed with him because they were exactly what he feared. Before Caleb could answer, a wagon rolled into the yard. Rose stepped down carrying a basket of supplies. She stopped when she saw Margaret. The two women looked at each other. Then Rose looked at Caleb. Not suspicious, just curious. "This is my aunt," Caleb said. Margaret offered a polite smile. "Margaret Whitaker." Rose nodded. Rose Bennett. The name meant something. Caleb saw it immediately. Margaret recognized it. But she said nothing, not there, not in front of Rose. Later that afternoon, after Margaret had left town, Caleb found Rose sitting on the porch sorting dried beans into jars. The sun was lowering behind the hills. "You didn't tell me you had family nearby," she said. Caleb leaned against the porch post. "I don't talk about them much." "Why?" He looked out toward the fields. "It's complicated." Rose watched him carefully. She did not push. That was one of the things about her that made him uncomfortable. Most people wanted answers immediately. Rose gave people room. Finally, she nodded. "All right, that was all. No accusation, no demand. Just acceptance." Somehow that made the guilt worse. The next morning, trouble returned. Samuel crossrode onto the Bennett property with two men behind him. Caleb was near the barn when he heard the horses. Rose stepped outside. Samuel removed his hat. "Morning." Rose did not smile. "What do you need?" Samuel looked around. "Just checking on things. You've done that 3 times this month. Maybe because things keep changing." His eyes moved toward Caleb. "New worker seems to be settling in." Caleb said nothing. Samuel looked back at Rose. "You know, I've been thinking about your land. I'm not selling. You haven't heard my offer." "I don't need to." Samuel smiled. "That confidence is admirable." Rose folded her arms. But confidence doesn't pay debts." The words landed quietly. Rose's expression changed, only slightly, but Caleb noticed. Samuel reached into his coat and pulled out a document. "I'm giving you one last chance before things become difficult." Caleb stepped closer. "What's that supposed to mean?" Samuel looked at him. "It means this doesn't concern hired hands." Rose took the paper. Her eyes moved across the page. Caleb watched her face. She stayed calm. Too calm. "What is this? An agreement? I never signed this." Samuel smiled. "Not yet." Caleb looked at the paper. Something about it bothered him, the wording, the confidence, the way Samuel stood there as if the outcome was already decided. Rose folded the document. "I'll look at it." Samuel tipped his hat. "Good choice." After he left, Caleb looked at Rose. "You're worried?" She placed the paper on the table. "I'm thinking." "About what?" "That Samuel Cross has never offered help unless he expects something in return." Caleb looked at the document. "Can you fight it?" Rose gave a small shrug. "I don't know." The answer bothered him, not because she sounded helpless, because she sounded used to standing alone. That evening, Caleb rode into Pine Creek to ask questions. He stopped at the general store. Mr. Wallace looked up. "You need something?" "Information." The older man studied him. About Samuel Cross. The shopkeeper's expression changed. "Careful." "Why?" "Because men like Samuel don't like people looking too closely." Caleb rested his hand on the counter. "What's his interest in Rose's land?" Mr. Wallace hesitated. Then he pulled an old ledger from beneath the counter. "I shouldn't show you this. But you are." The man sighed. "Because I think someone needs to." The ledger contained old accounts, payments, receipts, names. Caleb scanned the pages. Then he stopped. One entry caught his attention. A payment connected to the Bennett property, dated years earlier, before Rose's parents died, before Samuel began pressuring her. Caleb looked up. "What is this?" Mr. Wallace shook his head. "I don't know." But Caleb knew something was wrong. On his way back to Rose's farm, he thought about the way Samuel spoke, the confidence, the paperwork, the assumption that Rose would eventually surrender. It was familiar, too familiar, because Caleb had seen people use money and influence that way his entire life. When he returned, Rose was still awake. A lamp burned beside the kitchen window. She sat at the table with papers spread around her. Caleb stepped inside. "You found something." She looked up. "How do you know?" "Because you look like I did when I was trying to solve a problem." For a moment, she smiled. Then it disappeared. "I don't know what I'm going to do." Caleb placed the ledger page on the table. "Maybe start here." Rose read it. Her eyes narrowed. "Where did you get this? From town?" She looked at him. "Why are you helping me?" The question was simple, but it stopped him because the real answer was too dangerous, because he cared. Because somewhere along the way, protecting Rose had become more important than protecting his secret. "I don't like seeing people treated unfairly." Rose held his gaze. For a few seconds, neither moved. Then she folded the paper carefully. "Thank you, Cole." 2 words. Nothing more. But Caleb felt the weight of them, because Rose Bennett thanked him for helping her. Not because of his money, not because of his name, just because he showed up. And outside, beyond the small farmhouse, the Montana wind moved through the fields, carrying with it the first signs that the life Caleb had built as Cole Turner was beginning to collide with the life he had left behind. For several days, Caleb tried to find a way forward. He searched through old records. He asked quiet questions in town. He followed every small clue connected to Samuel Cross and the Bennett property. But every answer led him back to the same problem. Someone had been trying to push Rose off her land for a long time, and whoever it was had counted on her being too tired to fight. That angered Caleb more than he expected. Not the kind of anger that made a man reckless, the quieter kind. The kind that made him sit awake at night staring into the darkness, thinking about all the times people with money and influence had assumed they could decide what happened to someone else. He knew that world. He had spent his entire life inside it. And now, for the first time, he was seeing it from the other side. Rose continued working as if nothing had changed. That was what impressed him most. The next morning, she repaired a broken section of the chicken coop. By noon, she delivered bread to town. In the afternoon, she reviewed the documents Samuel had brought. She did not complain. She did not ask Caleb to solve everything. She simply kept moving. One evening, as they sat near the barn sorting through the papers, Caleb watched her carefully organize every receipt and note. "You've been keeping records for years," Rose looked up. "Yes, why?" She placed a paper into a folder. "Because people forget." Caleb looked at the stack, or pretend to. Rose met his eyes, sometimes both. The answer stayed with him, because it was something he understood. People remembered what benefited them. They forgot what did not. A week later, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Cole Turner. Caleb recognized the handwriting before he opened it. Margaret. He waited until evening. Rose had already gone inside. The lantern on the table cast a soft glow as he unfolded the paper. The message was short. "Caleb, you cannot hide forever. Evelyn Parker has been asking questions. Your absence is creating problems. More importantly, someone is moving against the Whitaker Ranch. You need to return." Caleb folded the letter. The name Evelyn felt like a door opening to a life he had left behind. A life filled with expectations, arrangements, people who knew exactly who he was supposed to become. The next morning he rode into Pine Creek. He had planned to speak with Margaret. Instead, he found Evelyn Parker waiting outside the general store. She stood beside a polished carriage, her dark coat buttoned neatly against the cold. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Evelyn looked at him. "Caleb." The name struck harder than he expected, not because she said it loudly, because she said it naturally, like the disguise had never existed. Caleb glanced around. Nobody nearby seemed to hear. "You shouldn't be here," Evelyn gave a small, disappointed smile. "That is what you say after disappearing for weeks? I needed time. For what?" He had no answer she would understand. Evelyn looked at his worn coat and dusty boots. "You really went through with this?" "Yes." "Why?" Caleb looked away. "Because I needed to know something, and did you?" He thought of Rose, her quiet kindness, her coffee on the porch, the way she had trusted him. "Yes," Evelyn studied him. Then she lowered her voice. "Does she know?" The question landed heavily. "No." Evelyn looked toward the road. "That is going to hurt her." Caleb knew. That was the part he could not escape. Before he could respond, a rider approached from the south. Samuel Cross. He stopped when he saw Caleb and Evelyn together. His eyes moved between them. Something changed in his expression. Recognition. Interest. A small smile. "Well," Samuel said, "looks like things are more complicated than I thought." Caleb stepped forward. "Samuel." Samuel looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Parker." She nodded politely. Samuel returned his attention to Caleb. "Or should I say Mr. Whitaker?" The world seemed to slow. Caleb said nothing. Samuel smiled. "I wondered how long you planned on playing cowboy." Evelyn's expression hardened. "Samuel," he continued, "people in Pine Creek deserve to know who they've been dealing with." Caleb's jaw tightened. "This is not the place," Samuel laughed softly. "Why? Afraid Rose might find out?" The words hit exactly where he intended. Caleb stepped closer. "Be careful." Samuel looked almost amused. "About what? About thinking you know everything?" Samuel adjusted his gloves. "I know enough." Then he rode away. Caleb stood still, because he knew Samuel had not come there by accident. He wanted Rose to find out, and he wanted it to happen in the worst possible way. That afternoon, Caleb returned to the Bennett Ranch. Rose was near the barn, repairing a leather strap. She looked up when she saw him. "You're quiet." He stopped near the fence. "Rose," something in his voice made her put down the strap. "What happened?" Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since he arrived in Pine Creek, he wished he had been less afraid. "I need to tell you something." Rose waited. Before he could speak, they heard horses approaching, Not one, several. Samuel Cross rode through the gate with 2 men behind him. Rose stood. "What is this?" Samuel smiled. "I thought you should know who your hired hand really is." Caleb's face changed. "Samuel, don't." But it was already too late. Samuel looked toward Rose. "His name isn't Cole Turner." The wind moved through the yard. Rose looked at Caleb, slowly, confused. Samuel continued, "His name is Caleb Whitaker." Silence. Rose stared at him. The name meant something. Everyone in Montana knew the Whitaker name, the cattle empire, the land, the wealth, the family everyone respected. Caleb watched her face change, not into greed, not excitement, something worse. Hurt. Samuel stepped forward. "The richest ranch owner in the territory has been living here pretending to be poor." Rose looked at Caleb. "Is that true?" He could have lied. One more time. One more excuse. But he was tired of hiding. Yes, the answer was quiet. But it broke something. Rose looked away. The pieces began fitting together, the way he spoke, the way he understood business, the way he carried himself. All the things she had noticed, but ignored. "You let me believe you were someone else." Caleb stepped closer. "Rose, I was going to tell you." "When?" He stopped, because he did not know. Rose nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." Samuel watched silently, enjoying the moment, but Caleb barely noticed him. All he saw was Rose standing in front of him, holding the truth he should have given her from the beginning. "I didn't come here to hurt you." Rose looked at him. No, her voice was calm. That somehow made it harder. "You came here because you wanted to know what people would do if they didn't know who you were." Caleb had no answer, because she was right. Rose looked toward the farmhouse. "I gave you work. Yes, I trusted you. Yes, and the whole time you knew something about yourself that I didn't." Caleb lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry." For a moment nobody spoke. Then Rose handed him the gloves he had left on the porch earlier that morning, the same gloves she had given him when he first arrived. "Take these." He looked at them. "Rose, please." He accepted them, slowly, carefully, as if they were something fragile. She turned away. Not because she hated him, because she did not know how to look at him anymore. And Caleb Whitaker, the man who owned thousands of acres and had never feared losing anything, stood in a small Montana yard realizing he had just lost the one thing he never knew he needed, the trust of the woman who chose him when he had nothing. The ride back to the Whitaker ranch felt longer than any journey Caleb had ever taken. The same roads he had traveled before now looked different. The hills were the same. The rivers cutting through the valley were the same. The mountains still stood in the distance, covered in the same pale morning light. But Caleb no longer saw them the way he used to, before Pine Creek. Those roads had led him home. Now they only led him back to a place that felt unfamiliar. His horse moved slowly beneath him. Caleb did not rush. There was nowhere he wanted to be. When he finally reached the Whitaker ranch, the gates opened immediately. The ranch hands recognized him. Men stepped forward. Workers removed their hats. The foreman greeted him with relief. "Mr. Whitaker." Caleb nodded. The words sounded strange. Mr. Whitaker, the name he had spent his whole life carrying. The name that had opened every door. The name that had just closed the one door that mattered. Inside the main house, everything was exactly as he had left it. The large entryway, the polished wooden floors, the paintings on the walls, the furniture that had been ordered from cities hundreds of miles away. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt empty. Margaret found him standing in the dining room, the same room where he had first admitted he wanted to know if anyone could love him without his fortune. She looked at him carefully. "She knows." Caleb nodded. Margaret did not ask how. She already understood. "What happened?" He removed his gloves and placed them on the table. "I lied." The answer was simple. Margaret waited. I told myself it was because I wanted the truth. He looked around the room, but I was still making a choice for her. I decided what she needed to know and when she needed to know it. Margaret sat down. That is not the same as not caring. No. Caleb looked at the empty chair across from him, but it still hurt her. The room became quiet. Outside, workers moved cattle through the lower pasture. The sound of hooves carried faintly through the windows. Margaret folded her hands. "Do you regret going?" Caleb thought about it for a long moment. He said nothing. Then no, his aunt looked surprised. "I regret how I handled it." He paused. "But I don't regret knowing her." That answer told Margaret everything, because Caleb Whitaker had always been a man who measured value carefully: land, money, business, risk. But for the first time, he spoke about something that could not be measured. The following weeks passed slowly. At the Whitaker Ranch, Caleb returned to his responsibilities. He attended meetings, reviewed contracts, signed documents, walked through fields with the foreman. He became the man everyone expected him to be again. But something was missing. The workers noticed. He no longer stayed in the office late studying reports. He no longer discussed expansion plans over dinner. Some evenings, he simply sat on the porch with a cup of coffee growing cold beside him. Margaret noticed that most of all. One night, she found him there. "You're thinking about going back?" Caleb looked toward the dark fields. "Yes, then why are you still here?" He did not answer, because he knew the truth. He was afraid, not of Rose rejecting him. He had already felt that pain. He was afraid of returning and seeing disappointment in her eyes. Meanwhile, several miles away, Rose Bennett was learning how to live without Cole Turner. At first, she thought the hardest part would be the work. It wasn't. She knew how to repair fences. She knew how to care for animals. She knew how to keep a small farm running. The hardest part was the quiet. There was no second set of footsteps near the barn, no extra coffee mug beside the stove, no voice asking questions while she worked, no one standing beside her at the fence line. She hated that she noticed because she was still hurt, and she refused to pretend otherwise. But feelings were not things a person could simply put away like papers in a drawer. Thomas noticed the difference. One morning, he found Rose sitting on the porch before sunrise. A basket of bread sat beside her, untouched. "You should be inside resting. I'm fine." Thomas leaned against the railing. "You always say that." Rose looked down. After a moment, she said, "I believed him." Thomas was quiet. "I know. I thought I knew who he was. You did." She looked up. "What?" Thomas shrugged. "Maybe he lied about his name. Maybe he lied about his money." He looked toward the fields, but the man who fixed your fences was real. Rose looked away. "That doesn't make it right." "No." Thomas nodded. "It doesn't." The answer surprised her, because she expected him to defend Caleb. Instead, he simply understood. A few weeks later, Rose returned to Pine Creek with more bread than usual. Business had been slow after everything happened, but she refused to let Samuel Cross or anyone else decide whether she would succeed. She placed her baskets inside the general store. Mr. Wallace looked at the amount. "You made all of this yourself?" "Yes," he smiled. "I'll need a bigger shelf." Word spread. At first, people came because they were curious. Then they came because the bread was good. A rancher from the northern road ordered several loaves for his workers. A family traveling through town bought pastries for the journey. Little by little, Rose's work became known beyond Pine Creek, not because people felt sorry for her, because she earned it. One afternoon, Samuel Cross walked into the store while Rose was counting coins from a sale. He looked at the small crowd gathered around her goods. "You seem busy." Rose did not look up. "I am." Samuel glanced at the shelves. "Interesting. What is?" "That people suddenly care about what you make." Rose placed the coins into a small wooden box. People care when something has value. Samuel's expression tightened. The answer was calm, but it was not the answer he expected. He stepped closer. "You should be careful, Rose." She looked at him. "About what?" "Thinking this changes things." Rose held his gaze. "I think it already has." For the first time, Samuel had no quick reply. He left without another word. That evening, Rose returned home as the sun disappeared behind the mountains. She placed the empty bread baskets on the table. Then she noticed something near the front gate, a small wooden crate. Inside were several repaired tools, a new handle for her shovel, fresh nails, a replacement hinge for the barn door. No note, no name. She stood there for a long time. She knew who had sent them, but she also knew he had not come himself. Maybe that was his way of respecting her. Maybe it was his way of admitting he was wrong. Rose touched the edge of the crate, then she stepped inside and closed the door. Across the Montana Valley, Caleb sat in the Whitaker dining room, the same long table, the same empty chair. But this time he understood something. Money could buy land. It could buy buildings. It could buy comfort. But it could not buy back trust once it was broken. And Rose Bennett was no longer the woman waiting for someone to choose her. She was becoming the woman who had learned to choose herself. The change did not happen overnight. There was no single morning when Rose woke up and suddenly forgot the pain of what happened. She still remembered the day Caleb Whitaker's secret was revealed. She remembered the way the name had sounded. Caleb Whitaker, a name that belonged to a world far away from her small farmhouse, her cracked kitchen table, and her muddy boots by the back door. For a while, hearing that name felt like a reminder that she had misunderstood everything. But time had a way of separating what hurt from what mattered. And as the weeks passed, Rose began to understand something. The woman who had worked beside Cole Turner had not been foolish. She had simply trusted someone. That was not a weakness. That was something worth protecting. So she returned to the things she knew, the land, the animals, the work, the quiet mornings, and most importantly, herself. By early autumn, Pine Creek had changed its opinion of Rose Bennett. Not completely. People rarely changed all at once, but they began noticing things they had ignored for years. The bread that came from her kitchen was better than anything sold in town. The small garden behind her house produced enough vegetables to supply several families. Her cattle were healthier than many larger ranches nearby. She was not surviving anymore. She was building. Every Thursday morning, Rose drove her wagon into Pine Creek with baskets covered by clean white cloth. The wheels rattled over the dirt road. The wooden sign above her wagon read, "Bennett Farm Goods." Simple, nothing fancy. But people stopped. A ranch worker from the Northern Valley bought 6 loaves at once. A family traveling toward the mountains bought a basket of pastries for their journey. Even people who once whispered about her began standing in line. One morning, a young girl approached the wagon holding a few coins in her hand. "Miss Bennett?" Rose looked down. "Yes, can I have one of the cinnamon rolls?" The girl counted her coins carefully. Rose looked at the amount. It was not enough, the girl noticed. "I can bring the rest next week." Rose smiled. "Take it." The girl hesitated. "But I don't have enough, I know." Rose wrapped the roll in paper. Sometimes people need a little help. The girl smiled and ran back toward her family. From across the street, Thomas watched. He shook his head. "You still do that?" Rose looked over. "Do what?" "Give away things you worked hard for." She adjusted the baskets. "I remember what it feels like when nobody helps." Thomas nodded. That was the thing about Rose. The world had made her harder, but it had not made her cruel. Meanwhile, at the Whitaker Ranch, Caleb was discovering that problems did not disappear simply because a man had money. In fact, sometimes money only hid them. The first warning came from the ranch accountant, a quiet man named Henry Miller, who had worked for the Whitaker family for nearly 20 years. He arrived at Caleb's office one afternoon carrying several folders. "These numbers don't look right." Caleb looked up from his desk. "What numbers?" Henry placed the folders down. Property purchases. Caleb opened the first document, then the second, then the third. Several smaller ranch parcels had been purchased over the years through different companies connected to the Whitaker name. At first glance, everything appeared legal, but the details bothered him. The prices, the timing, the names involved. "These were approved by my father?" Henry nodded. "Most of them." Caleb leaned back. His father had always been known as a strong businessman, a man who built an empire. But now Caleb wondered how many people had paid the price for that empire. Who handled these transactions? Henry hesitated. "Your father's attorney at the time, who?" Henry looked down. "Samuel Cross's father." The room went quiet. Caleb looked again at the documents. Samuel. The same man pressuring Rose. The same man who seemed so confident that her land would eventually belong to him. A cold feeling settled in Caleb's chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something heavier. Disappointment. He had spent his life defending a family name without knowing everything attached to it. That evening, Caleb rode out alone. He stopped near the edge of the Whitaker property where the land overlooked the valley. From there, he could see the direction of Rose's farm, a small piece of land compared to everything he owned. But somehow it felt more important, because Rose had built something there without needing anyone's approval. The next morning, Caleb returned to Pine Creek. He did not go to Rose's house, not yet. He went to the courthouse. The old building smelled of paper, dust, and wood polish. A clerk behind the counter looked up. "Can I help you? I need records." "What kind?" "Land records. Bennett property." The clerk studied him. "That goes back several years, I know." After several hours of searching through old files, Caleb found what he was looking for. But he also found something else. A name, a witness, a missing document. Something was wrong. Before he could investigate further, a voice came from behind him. "You look like a man who found something he wasn't supposed to." Caleb turned. The man standing there carried a leather briefcase and wore a dark traveling coat covered with dust from the road. "I'm Daniel Brooks." Caleb recognized the name, a traveling lawyer known for handling complicated land disputes across the territory. "What do you want?" Daniel glanced at the documents. "Maybe the same thing you do. And what's that?" "The truth." The two men sat in the courthouse office while Daniel explained what he had discovered. For months, he had been looking into several land disputes around Pine Creek, not just Rose's, others too. Small ranch owners, families who had suddenly found themselves facing unexpected claims. Someone has been using old agreements and questionable paperwork to gain control of land. Caleb looked down. Samuel Cross. Daniel nodded. "His name appears often." Caleb closed the file. "How much does Rose know?" "Probably less than she should." That answer bothered him, because Rose had spent years fighting a battle she never knew was being arranged. Later that afternoon, Caleb rode toward the Bennett farm. He stopped before reaching the gate. He watched from a distance. Rose was outside repairing a wagon wheel. Her sleeves were rolled up. Her hair was pulled back. She looked tired, but she looked strong. A year ago, he would have ridden directly to her. He would have offered help. Money, resources, a solution. Now he stayed where he was because he was beginning to understand something. Helping someone did not mean taking control of their life. Sometimes it meant standing beside them, not in front, not above, beside. That evening, Samuel Cross arrived at Rose's property. Caleb watched from the road. Samuel handed Rose a document. She read it carefully. Then her expression changed. From the distance, Caleb could see she understood the seriousness of it. Samuel said something. Rose answered. She did not step back. She did not lower her head. She folded the paper and handed it back. Whatever he had said, she was not accepting defeat. Caleb turned his horse around. Not because he wanted to leave, because he knew he could not enter her life again pretending to be the man who had all the answers. The next step had to be different. For the first time, Caleb Whitaker was not trying to save Rose Bennett. He was trying to become someone worthy of standing beside her. And neither of them knew that the truth hidden in those old documents would soon force them to face not only Samuel Cross, but the darker parts of the fortune Caleb had inherited. For 3 days, Caleb barely slept. The documents from the courthouse sat on his desk every night. He read them again and again, not because he did not understand the words, because he did. That was what bothered him. The Whitaker name was written across those pages, his family name, the same name people respected throughout Montana, the same name Caleb had spent his life protecting. But now he saw things he had never noticed before. Small ranches purchased after families fell behind on payments. Agreements written in ways ordinary people would struggle to understand. Deals that benefited the Whitaker company while leaving others with little choice. Nothing that looked openly wrong at first glance. That was what made it worse. Everything had been carefully arranged, legally, quietly, without anyone asking whether it was right. Caleb sat alone in his office as morning light came through the window. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside the papers. Margaret entered carrying a small stack of letters. She stopped when she saw the documents spread across the desk. "What did you find?" Caleb did not answer immediately. He picked up one page. "Did you know?" Margaret walked closer. "Know what?" "That my father used these agreements to take control of smaller ranches." Her expression changed. Slowly, she looked at the papers. "Caleb, did you know?" The question was not angry. That made it harder. Margaret lowered her eyes. "Not everything." He leaned back. "What does that mean?" "It means your father was a complicated man." Caleb looked away. "That's what people say when they don't want to say the truth." Margaret sat down. "Your father believed he was building something that would survive. And if people were hurt along the way," she was quiet because there was no easy answer. Caleb stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the Whitaker ranch moved like it always had. Workers checking cattle, wagons moving supplies, the sound of a hammer from the repair shed, a machine that had been running for years, but now Caleb wondered how many people had been pushed aside to keep it moving. "I thought I was different." Margaret looked at him. "You are, am I?" The question hung there because Caleb knew something important. He had spent weeks judging people who valued him only for his money, but he had also benefited from that money without asking enough questions about where it came from. The realization sat heavier than any accusation. Later that afternoon, Caleb met Daniel Brooks again. The lawyer placed another folder on the table. "There's more." Caleb opened it. Inside were copies of old agreements. Several involved land near Pine Creek, including the Bennett property. Daniel pointed to a signature. This agreement was made shortly before Rose's parents died. Caleb studied it. "What does it mean?" "It means someone had an interest in that land long before Samuel Cross came forward." Caleb looked up. "Who?" Daniel hesitated, then answered. "Your family." Silence filled the room. For a moment, Caleb could hear only the ticking of the clock on the courthouse wall. "My family wanted Rose's land?" "Not exactly." Daniel closed the folder. "But someone connected to your family created the opportunity for someone else to claim it." Caleb looked down. That was almost worse, because it meant Rose's struggle was not some random misfortune. It was connected to the same fortune he had tried to escape. That evening, Caleb rode to Pine Creek, not to the ranch, not to Rose's home. To the small diner where people gathered after work. He sat in the corner with Daniel. Across him, he saw Rose enter carrying a basket of bread. She spoke with the owner. She smiled at an older customer. She moved through the room with the same quiet confidence she had always carried. Caleb watched, and for a moment, he remembered the first day he saw her. The woman everyone ignored. the woman who offered a stranger work without knowing his name. He had wanted to prove that someone could love him without wealth. But now he understood something else. Rose had never needed him to be poor. She needed him to be honest. The next morning, Caleb went to the Bennett farm. Rose was outside near the barn. When she saw him, she stopped. Neither spoke for several seconds. The distance between them felt larger than the few steps separating them. Finally, Caleb removed his hat. Rose. She nodded. Pleb. Hearing his real name from her still felt strange. I found something. Her expression changed slightly. About Samuel? Yes, she waited, but also about my family. That caught her attention. Caleb held out the folder. I found records connecting my father's business dealings to some of the land disputes around Pine Creek. Rose did not take the papers immediately. Why are you telling me? Because you deserve to know. She studied him. And what does that change? Caleb looked down. Maybe nothing. He paused. But I need to be honest about it. Rose accepted the folder. She opened it slowly. The pages moved slightly in the wind. After reading for several minutes, she closed them. So your family was involved? Yes, the answer came without hesitation. No excuses, no explanations, just the truth. Rose looked at him. That must be difficult. It is. She looked toward the fields. Do you still believe you can fix everything with money? The question was quiet, but it mattered. Caleb shook his head. No. What do you believe? He thought for a moment, then said, I believe some things have to be made right, even if it costs me. Rose looked back at him. The old Caleb would have offered a solution, a payment, a contract, something that could be signed and finished. This man standing in front of her was different, not because he had lost his wealth, because he had finally started questioning it. I'm not ready to forgive you, Rose said. Caleb nodded. I know. I don't know if I can forget what happened. I don't expect you to. Another silence. But this one was not the same as before. It was not the silence of two people separated by hurt. It was the silence of two people standing near the beginning of understanding. Before Caleb left, Rose spoke. Thank you for telling me. He looked back. For what? For not hiding this. The words were small, but they mattered. Caleb tipped his hat and walked away. He did not ask her to come back. He did not ask her to trust him again. For the first time, he understood that love was not something a person could earn by forcing the right outcome. It was something another person had to freely give. That night, Samuel Cross sat inside his office looking over his own papers. He had built his plans around one belief, that Rose Bennett would eventually give up, that Caleb Whitaker would protect his family name, that money would always win. But he had miscalculated, because Caleb Whitaker was no longer the man who only cared about protecting his fortune, and Rose Bennett was no longer the woman who could be pushed aside. The coming winter would test both of them, and before it was over, Pine Creek would learn that the strongest people were not always the ones with the most land. Sometimes they were the ones who had the courage to admit what they had done wrong. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow came quietly, covering the Montana fields with a thin white layer that disappeared by afternoon. But everyone knew the real storms were still coming. The old ranchers watched the sky more than the calendar. They checked the wind, they checked the clouds, they checked the condition of their animals. A bad winter could test even the strongest families. At the Whitaker Ranch, Caleb spent his mornings preparing for the cold months ahead. He ordered extra feed, he inspected the barns, he made sure the workers had enough supplies. But something was different now. Before, he would have focused only on protecting his own land. Now he looked beyond his fences. He thought about the smaller ranches around Pine Creek, the families who did not have extra money stored away, the people who could not simply replace what was lost, the people his family had once overlooked. Margaret noticed the change. One morning she found Caleb reviewing supply records. You're sending feed to the smaller ranches? Caleb looked up. Yes. She glanced at the list. Some of these families have never done business with us, I know. Some of them have spoken poorly about the Whitaker name. Caleb placed the papers down. That doesn't mean they should freeze. Margaret studied him. A year ago, she would never have heard those words from him, not because Caleb was cruel, because he had spent his life believing responsibility ended at his own gates. Now he understood the world was larger than that. A few miles away, Rose Bennett continued running her farm. The winter weather made everything harder. The roads became rough. The mornings became colder. The work took longer. But Rose kept going. Her bread business had grown enough that she could pay her bills more comfortably. She had replaced broken tools. She repaired part of the barn roof. She even hired a young ranch hand twice a week to help with the heavier work. Not because she needed someone to save her, because she had built enough to allow herself some help. Thomas noticed the difference. You're smiling more. Rose looked up from the kitchen table. I am? Yes. She looked toward the window. Snow covered the fence line. I suppose I am. Thomas leaned back in his chair. Why? Rose was quiet. Then she answered honestly. Because I finally feel like this place is mine. That meant more than she expected. For years, she had fought to prove she belonged. Now, she no longer needed to prove anything. She simply lived there. One evening, a storm warning reached Pine Creek. The temperature dropped quickly. The wind changed direction. The kind of wind that made old ranchers close their doors early. By sunset, snow began falling heavily. Caleb stood outside the Whitaker barn, watching the sky darken. The foreman walked beside him. This one looks bad. Caleb nodded. How many families are still out? Hard to say. The foreman looked toward town. Some folks might not make it back before the roads close. Caleb immediately grabbed his coat. We need to check. The foreman looked surprised. Tonight? Yes. The storm grew worse within an hour. Snow covered the roads. The horses moved carefully through the deepening drifts. Caleb and several ranch hands traveled toward Pine Creek, checking homes along the way. At the edge of town, they found several families struggling. A wagon stuck near a frozen road, an older couple unable to reach their woodpile. A ranch worker whose barn door had broken loose. Nobody asked who Caleb was. Nobody cared about the Whitaker name. They only saw a man willing to help. And Caleb was beginning to realize that was the kind of man he wanted to be. Near midnight, word came from the Bennett farm. A section of the eastern fence had collapsed under the weight of snow. The cattle were at risk of wandering into the storm. Caleb froze when he heard the name Rose. For a moment he stood still. Then he grabbed his coat. The ranch hand beside him noticed. You sure? Caleb looked toward the dark road. No. He tightened his gloves. But I'm going. The ride to the Bennett farm was slow. The wind pushed against them. Snow covered the trail. By the time Caleb reached the property, his horse was covered in frost. The farmhouse windows glowed with warm light. Rose opened the door before he knocked. For a moment, neither spoke. The last time they had stood this close, everything between them had been broken. Now snow fell around them, and the world seemed quieter. What are you doing here? Rose asked. Caleb removed his hat. The fence. She looked past him toward the storm. You came all this way for a fence? No. He paused. For your cattle. Rose studied his face. Not the face of the wealthy ranch owner. Not the face of the man who had hidden behind a false name. Just Caleb, a man standing in the snow asking nothing in return. You didn't have to come, I know. That answer surprised her, because before Caleb always tried to explain. Now he simply accepted. Rose stepped aside. Come inside first. You're freezing. The words were quiet, but Caleb noticed. She was still hurt. She was still cautious, but she was not heartless. Inside the farmhouse, Rose poured coffee into a mug and placed it in front of him. The same simple kindness she had shown him months before. Caleb wrapped his hands around the warm cup. For a few moments, they listened to the storm. Then Rose spoke. "You're different." Caleb looked down. "I should be." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because I was wrong." The honesty made her pause. He continued. "I thought if I removed my money, I would find out who people really were." Rose stayed quiet, but I never stopped to think about whether I was being fair. The fire cracked softly. "You deserved the truth." Rose looked into her coffee. "Yes." A long silence followed. Not comfortable, not painful, just honest. Finally, Rose stood. "The fence won't fix itself." A small smile touched Caleb's face. "No." She grabbed her coat. "Then let's go." Together they stepped back into the storm. Not as they had before, not as a ranch hand and his employer, not as a wealthy man hiding from his life, just two people working toward the same thing. They spent hours repairing the damaged fence. Caleb carried the heavier boards. Rose checked the posts. They moved carefully through the snow. Neither spoke much. They did not need to. By morning, the cattle were safe. The storm began to weaken. The sky turned pale above the mountains. Caleb stood beside the repaired fence, looking across Rose's land. "This place has changed." Rose looked at him. "How?" He glanced around, "Because it feels like it belongs to someone who knows its worth." She looked away, but not before he saw the small change in her expression. Later that day, as people in Pine Creek heard about the storm, they also heard something else. Caleb Whitaker had spent the night helping families across the valley, not from the comfort of his office, not by sending someone else. He had been there himself, and Rose Bennett had stood beside him. Samuel Cross heard the news from his office. He read the reports. He saw the way people were beginning to speak differently about Caleb, and he realized something dangerous. The man he thought he understood had changed, and the woman he thought would eventually give up had become stronger than ever. The storm had passed, but the real battle in Pine Creek was only beginning, because Samuel Cross still had one last move, and this time he was not just fighting for land, he was fighting against the truth. For the first time in his life, Caleb Whitaker understood that winning did not always mean keeping everything. Sometimes it meant being willing to lose what you had built. After the winter storm, Pine Creek felt different. The snow slowly melted from the rooftops. The roads became muddy again. The frozen streams began moving beneath thin layers of ice. Life returned to the valley, but something had changed among the people. They had seen who Caleb really was, not the wealthy ranch owner whose name appeared on contracts, not the man whose family controlled thousands of acres. They had seen him carrying supplies through the storm. They had seen him repairing fences beside Rose Bennett. They had seen him help without asking for recognition. But Caleb knew that was not enough. Helping people during a storm did not erase what he had done. It did not erase the secret. It did not erase the hurt. And most importantly, it did not give him the right to expect Rose to forgive him. A few days after the storm, Caleb rode to Rose's farm. He stopped at the gate. This time, he did not enter without permission. He waited. Rose was outside near the barn, checking the condition of the animals after the harsh weather. When she saw him, she placed the papers she was holding on the fence. "Caleb," he removed his hat. "Rose." The distance between them was smaller than before, but it was still there. "I wanted to talk." Rose looked toward the house, then back at him. "All right." He stepped closer, but not too close. "I know I hurt you." Rose said nothing. "I know an apology doesn't change what happened." The wind moved through the bare branches above them. Caleb continued. "I spent my whole life believing people only saw my money. I thought if I removed it, I would finally understand who was real." He looked down. but I never considered that I was taking away your choice. Rose watched him carefully. You were. Caleb nodded. I was. The simple agreement surprised her, because she expected an explanation, a defense, something that would make the pain easier for him. But he did not offer one. I should have trusted you enough to tell you the truth. Rose looked away. For a moment, the only sound was the movement of horses in the nearby pasture. I cared about Cole Turner. The words were quiet. Caleb looked up. I know. No. She looked at him. You don't. He stayed silent, because Cole Turner was the man who showed up every morning, the man who worked until his hands hurt, the man who listened when I talked. Her voice softened. That person was real, Caleb swallowed. And Caleb Whitaker? Rose looked toward the fields. I'm still trying to understand him. The answer hurt, but Caleb accepted it. Because it was honest. A year earlier, he would have tried to fix the situation immediately. He would have offered money, land, security, anything that could make the problem disappear. Now he knew some things could not be repaired by signing a document. I don't want to come back as Caleb Whitaker, the ranch owner. Rose looked at him. Then who are you coming back as? He took a slow breath. The man you met? The silence that followed felt different, not empty, not cold, just uncertain. Before Rose could answer, a rider appeared at the edge of the property. Samuel Cross. He stopped near the gate. The moment was interrupted. Samuel looked between them. Well? His tone carried satisfaction. I was wondering how long this reunion would take. Rose's expression hardened. What do you want? Samuel pulled a folded document from his coat. Actually, I think you'll want to see this. Caleb stepped forward. Samuel. No, Samuel looked at Rose. This concerns her. Rose accepted the paper. She read the first few lines, then her face changed. Caleb noticed. What is it? She handed it to him. The document claimed that the Bennett property had outstanding obligations connected to an old family agreement, a claim that could threaten her ownership. Caleb looked at Samuel. This is false, Samuel smiled. Can you prove it? Caleb looked down at the paper. That was the problem. He could suspect. He could investigate, but suspicion was not proof. Samuel adjusted his coat. You see, this is how things work. Records matter. Names matter. He looked at Caleb. Something you should know better than anyone. The words were deliberate. Samuel wanted Caleb to remember the Whitaker name, the power, the history, the very things Caleb had spent months trying to separate himself from. Rose folded the document. We'll review this. Samuel smiled. I'm sure you will. After he left, Caleb stood quietly. Rose looked at him. What? He shook his head. Nothing. That's not true. Caleb looked at the paper. Samuel knows exactly what he's doing. Yes. And he's counting on me using my position to force an answer. Rose watched him. And will you? The question mattered because she was not asking about Samuel. She was asking about Caleb. The old Caleb would have called lawyers immediately. He would have used every advantage available. He would have made the problem disappear. But that was not the man standing in front of her now. No, Rose studied him. No, I'll help find the truth. He paused. But I won't take control of your life. Something changed in her expression, small, almost invisible, but Caleb saw it. That evening, Daniel Brooks arrived in Pine Creek with additional records. Together, Caleb, Rose, and Daniel worked through the documents, not in the Whitaker office, not in a place of power. In Rose's small kitchen, the same kitchen where Caleb had once sat as Cole Turner, the same table where she had trusted him. The papers covered the wooden surface, receipts, land records, old agreements. Hours passed, then Daniel stopped. I found something. Rose leaned closer. Daniel pointed to a line near the bottom of the page, this signature. Caleb looked. His expression changed. It was not Samuel Cross. It was a former Whitaker Company representative, someone who had acted under his father's authority, someone who had created the foundation for Samuel's claim. Rose looked at Caleb. "So this really does connect back to your family?" Caleb nodded. "Yes," Daniel closed the folder. "But it also proves something else." "What?" "The original agreement was never completed properly." Rose looked confused. Daniel explained. "The claim Samuel is using may not be valid. For the first time in weeks, hope entered the room. Not the kind that came from pretending everything was easy, the kind that came from finally knowing the truth." Later that night, Caleb stepped outside. The air was cold. The fields were quiet. Rose joined him a few minutes later. Neither spoke at first. Finally, she said, "You really are different." Caleb looked toward the horizon. "I'm trying to be." Rose nodded. "That matters." He looked at her. Not with expectation, not with a demand, just gratitude. Then Samuel Cross made his final move. The next morning, word spread through Pine Creek that Samuel planned to speak publicly at the town gathering. He claimed he would reveal the truth about Rose Bennett's land. But Caleb knew something. Samuel was not just trying to win a legal fight. He was trying to control the story, and Caleb had spent his entire life learning one thing. A person could lose land, a person could lose money, but losing the truth was something far more dangerous, because the truth was the only thing that could set them free. The morning of the Pine Creek gathering arrived beneath a clear Montana sky. For the first time in weeks, the weather was calm. The snow had melted from the rooftops. The roads were firm again. People came into town from nearby ranches and farms, gathering near the church and the wooden platform built beside the courthouse. Everyone knew why they were there. Samuel Cross had promised answers. He had spent days telling people that Rose Bennett's land was built on a mistake, that old agreements could change everything, that someone had been hiding the truth. And in a way, he was right. There had been hidden truths, but not the ones Samuel wanted people to believe. Rose arrived with Thomas. She wore a simple blue dress and a dark coat against the morning chill. Nothing about her clothing demanded attention, but people noticed her anyway, not because of rumors, not because of judgment, because they had started seeing her differently. The woman who once walked through town with her eyes lowered now entered with steady steps. Thomas walked beside her. "You sure you want to do this?" Rose looked toward the crowd. "Yes, you don't have to prove anything." She nodded. "I know, that was the difference." For years, Rose had felt like every moment was a test, every conversation, every glance, every opinion. Now she understood something. She did not need everyone to approve of her. She only needed the truth to stand. Across the street, Caleb stood beside Daniel Brooks. He wore a dark coat and carried no documents in his hands. No symbols of wealth, no sign of the Whitaker name, just himself. Margaret stood nearby. She had traveled to Pine Creek after Caleb told her what he planned to do. She knew this moment mattered, not only for Rose, for Caleb too. Samuel Cross stepped onto the platform as the crowd quieted. He looked confident, too confident. That was what Caleb noticed. Men who knew they had lost usually looked nervous. Samuel looked like someone who still believed he controlled the ending. "Neighbors," Samuel began, "I called you here because there are matters concerning the Bennett property that cannot be ignored." He held up a document. Records show questions about the ownership of that land. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Rose stood still. Samuel continued, "For years, people have accepted things without looking closely." His eyes moved toward Caleb, and some people have benefited from that. The crowd turned. Everyone knew who he meant. Caleb stepped forward. Samuel smiled slightly. "Mr. Whitaker." Caleb looked at him. "Samuel." The use of his name surprised some people. The old power dynamic was gone. Samuel held up the paper. Would you like to explain how your family name appears in these records? Caleb looked at the crowd, then at Rose, then back at Samuel. Yes. Town became silent. Caleb stepped onto the platform. For a moment, he looked like the man everyone expected him to be, the wealthy ranch owner, the powerful businessman, the person who could make problems disappear. But then he spoke. My family name does appear in these records. The crowd listened, and that is something I cannot change. Samuel's smile returned, but only briefly. Interesting. Caleb continued. What I can do is tell the truth about what happened. Daniel handed him the documents. Caleb held them up. These records show that agreements were created years ago through the Whitaker Company. Some of those agreements were unfair to smaller ranch families. The crowd became restless. Samuel's expression changed. Caleb did not stop. My family benefited from decisions that hurt people who had less power. Margaret looked down. She knew how difficult those words were for him. Caleb continued, but that does not mean those decisions should continue. Samuel stepped forward. You expect people to believe you're admitting fault now? Caleb looked at him. I expect them to see the evidence. Daniel stepped forward next. He explained the missing documents, the incomplete agreement, the improper claim, the reason Samuel's attempt to take Rose's land was not valid. The crowd listened. Slowly, the story changed, not because Caleb was rich, not because people feared him, because the facts were finally visible. Samuel looked around. The confidence he arrived with was gone. This isn't over. Rose stepped forward. For years, she had let others speak about her life. Not today. No, her voice was calm. But it is finished. Everyone looked at her. She held Samuel's gaze. You spent years believing I would eventually give up. Samuel said nothing. But you were wrong. The words were not angry. They were simply true. I was never waiting for someone to save me. She glanced briefly toward Caleb. I was waiting for the chance to stand on my own. The crowd was silent, and for once nobody whispered. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. After the gathering ended, people slowly returned to their homes. The matter was not forgotten, but it was settled. Later that evening, Caleb found Rose near her barn. The sun was setting behind the mountains, the same view he had seen many times while pretending to be someone else. Only now there was no pretending. I owe you another apology, he said. Rose looked over. For what? For making you believe I was someone I wasn't. She studied him. You were Cole. He nodded. And Caleb, a small smile touched her face. Both of them were you. He looked surprised. Rose stepped closer. The problem was never that you had money, she paused. The problem was that you thought you had to hide it from me. Caleb looked down. I was afraid. I know, that answer meant more than forgiveness, because she understood. Not because the pain disappeared, because she had seen the man beneath it. Caleb reached into his coat. He did not pull out a diamond ring, he did not bring a document, he did not offer land. He held a simple ring, plain, unremarkable, the kind of ring a man could buy without anyone knowing his name. Rose Bennett. She looked at him. I don't want you to marry Caleb Whitaker, the ranch owner. The wind moved softly through the grass. I don't want you to choose me because of what I have. He took a breath. I want you to choose the man who fixed fences with you, the man who drank coffee on your porch, the man who learned that having everything means nothing if you have nobody to share it with. Rose looked at the ring, then at him. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, you know, Cole Turner was much easier to understand. A small laugh escaped him. I know, but Caleb Whitaker has been learning. He nodded. I have. Rose looked toward the fields, the land she had fought for, the home she had built, the life she had created. Then she looked back. I don't need a man to complete my life. Caleb smiled softly. I know. That's why I can choose one. She placed her hand in his. Years later, travelers passing through Pine Creek would hear many stories. They would hear about the Whitaker Ranch, the cattle, the land, the fortune. But the story people remembered most was not about wealth. It was about a cowboy who gave up everything to find out whether anyone could love him without knowing his name. And a woman everyone overlooked who taught him that the greatest thing a person could own was not land, money, or reputation. It was the heart of someone who saw the truth. Rose Bennett was once the woman nobody chose, but in the end, she became the woman chosen not because she needed saving, because she had already saved herself. And that was exactly why Caleb Whitaker loved her. Years later, people would still tell the story of the wealthy cowboy who walked away from comfort and found something money could never buy. But the heart of the story was never about a fortune, a ranch, or a name carved into history. It was about two people who carried wounds they never showed the world. Imagine standing where Caleb stood, wondering if anyone would choose you when everything that made you important was taken away. Or imagine standing where Rose stood, after years of being overlooked, and finally realizing your worth was never decided by someone else's judgment. Their journey reminds us that love is not built on perfection. It is built on honesty, patience, and the courage to return after mistakes have been made. Sometimes healing comes when we stop asking someone else to prove our value and begin seeing the strength that was already there. Caleb found a woman who loved the man beneath the fortune. Rose found a man who learned to love her without trying to change her. And maybe that is the kind of love most people spend a lifetime hoping to find. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts with us in the comments. Tell us what moment in Caleb and Rose's journey stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories of love, mystery, healing, and second chances from the old frontier and beyond, consider subscribing. There are many more unforgettable journeys waiting for you in the stories ahead.